Johnny, we left off with Kino, how that didn't work out because Bill Drake wanted a tight playlist and you wanted to play great music. And
that's a nice way of putting it. That's very good.
But ironically, he went on to, become this big name by tightening things. And some people didn't like that, but you moved on. So tell us what happened after that.
I made a big mistake. There was a sheet that came out every week called the Gavin Report. Mm-hmm. It was run by Bill Gavin and his wife.
Right.
It was the most respected sheet in the fact that it wasn't full of hype. It was full of programming and music people who really took pride in their playlists and shared the songs, the music, the shakers at the time. So if you read his report consistently, you would know after a while which guys in the country to pay attention to, because they had a good reputation for being able to break hits or to know what was going on.
Were those always major market guys?
No, not really. At all. Most of them were from the secondary markets because the major guys were interested in only playing the certain hits.
That they were paid to play, right?
I don't know if they were always paid to play them or not, but apparently there was some of that went on. Anything that came from Little Eva,
Locomotion,
the Dixie Cups,
Chapel of Love.
Oh God, those were all the result of a lot of heavy promotional activities, which involved...
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, very much so. But Gavin was good, and if Bill Gavin liked you, then you were always appearing on his sheet, and were always getting awards at his yearly convention, etc., etc. His people were more devoted people when it came to broadcasting and to music in particular. So Bill and I became good friends. I'm about to walk out the door at Kino in Fresno, and I was going to go to KXJO in San Jose.
Was that rock at the time?
Yes. And at the time, Bill called me and asked me to do him a personal favor and to go to KJOY in Stockton and to work for the guys down there. They were in ratings trouble. KSTN and Bill Drake was giving them a little bit of a fit. So I went to work at KJOY in Stockton, which was the worst experience of my life. The guy who ran it was a good guy, and he would back you 100%. Everybody else on the staff hated me because I rocked the boat. Okay? Unfortunately, the good guy died at his desk. And this was about the time of the JFK assassination. So all of a sudden you're sitting there and having to program in something that I had no experience in. And everything sounded wrong that you went to, because when the first bulletins came out, you went back to your normal programming, but playing the Dixie Chicks or the Singing Cups. Nun didn't really make it, in your mind. So you kept trying to tone it back by playing more of, let's say, Sinatra or Al Martino, and that didn't sound right. And as it ended up, most of the stations ended up going back and going to classical music.
Because it's instrumental.
It's instrumental, soft, respectful, etc., etc. And of course, none of the rock and roll stations had a classical music library. So we'd head to Tower Records and give me everything A through H, and I'll see if we need more tomorrow. So we did, and that's how we programmed the radio stations at the time. Joe Gamble was the guy's name who ran the station, who died at his desk, And once he was gone, my life just, it didn't work right.
Hmm.
So I'm sitting there and decide it's time to move on, much to their happiness, and ended up going to go to work for KXOA, but also going to go to work for KROY. And there was a friendlier atmosphere in the market at that time.
Mhm.
One of the DJs at KROY had a death in the family, had to go back east, and was going to be gone for a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, I'm hired at KXOA, and there's a 2-week hold on that because at the time, Buck Herring, who was at KXOA, was going to move over to KROY.
Right.
So I fill in at KROY for the 2 weeks, and then I move over to KXOA, and Buck Herring moves over to KROY.
Musical chairs.
Absolutely. So some people thought that I was edging out Buck Herring at KXOA, which really wasn't my intent. Buck's a good guy. But I could understand how the rumor grew, because eventually I ended up going back from KXOA back to KROY,
Mhm.
and one of the first things that we had to do was to escort Buck Herring out the door. Which,
Wow.
yeah, really. Buck hasn't spoken to me since, by the way, and I apologize for that, but that's just the way that it went at that time.
Mhm.
So Dwight Case had called me. He was the general manager of KROY, and he called and he offered me a lot of money for the Times.
Hmm.
But he also made it very clear that all but $1,000 was to get me out of his hair, and $1,000 was for my talent. So I came over to KROY, and they had these weird, convoluted promotions on the air. When I walked in, they were running a contest called The Witch's Laugh. And if you were the third person to call in after you heard The Witch's Laugh, you won 2 tickets to go to Governor's Hall, which was the hip spot in town for the Witch's Ball. Okay. So I go over to KROY and I play The Witch's Laugh during a song, and nobody calls. So I turn down the volume of the music a little more and goose up The Witch's Laugh and hit it again, and nobody called. So I called my wife and I said, "Are you getting me okay?" And she said, "I can't get you at all." KROY had such a bad signal
Right.
at the time.
It's a low power station.
Oh, it was absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
So that's when I got together with Dwight and says, "Hey, I know this engineer. He had done KXOA. He was absolutely brilliant. His name is Don Trafton. Let's get him over here and make this radio station sound right." So we hired Don. I gave him a copy of Blood, Sweat, and Tears album. And I said, "When the radio station sounds like this, call me." And it was about 6 weeks later that he called me in the middle of the night and said, "Turn on the radio." I did, and gee whiz, you could hear all the brass, you could hear the horns, but more importantly than anything else, you could hear the station.
Right.
You know, and I was living in Foothill Farms
Mhm.
at the time. You could hear the station. It sounded crisp, it sounded clean, and it made everybody else sound muddy
Mm.
in the market. So we had the engineering problem solved with it. In the meantime, I had been working on the DJ aspect of it, which was you're not an announcer. Get that out of your head. You are not a comedian. Get that out of your head. I had the listeners send in pictures of themselves, and we ended up covering 2 walls with these pictures of listeners. So the idea of it was for the DJ, when you're saying anything, pick a picture. I don't care what picture you pick, but you talk to that one individual and you make it important to that individual. And your next set, pick another individual. Make this one-on-one theater of the mind.
Is that all your idea, or did you get that from someone else?
No, that was my idea.
Wow, that's an amazing idea.
I had in my mind, on the old days of Zenith radios, they used to have an oscilloscope. And the bigger the band that you got to go around without touching was when you had the station tuned to perfection. It was coming in at its best. And I considered our entire radio station to have to fit within that oscilloscope in my mind. And once it did that, then I was happy with it. And once you converted the DJs to not try to be funny men or try to be announcers or try to
be a hokey DJ.
Yeah, they would try to back talk into a record, and they'd miss it 9 out of 10 times and step on the vocal, and that was just really stupid to me.
Yeah.
So I'm trying
Listeners
to get
probably hated that, right?
Well, of course they hated it, because you're sitting there and that's their favorite song.
Yeah.
And you're sitting there talking about a car wash next Wednesday. Who cares? Just talk to them about what is right now and leave it at that.
All right, and we'll be talking more about that with Johnny Hyde coming up in the next segment.